Yes, I'm speaking as a fellow founder of the college about Ron McArthur and a friend. And I didn't promise him that I wouldn't say any nice things about him. The first thing I would say about him is that, the college itself did not start up because of the crisis in education that took place in the late 60s. Indeed, that was the occasion in a way for it to start, but that's not where the college comes from. There were many other movements that were taking place around the 70s that I think were really reactions to what had happened in education as a whole, eruption that just sort of destroyed all traditional education. And of course, liberal education was on its way out. Mario Savio, who led protests at the University of California at Sather Gate, says, "Trust nobody over 30, right?" And I know of libraries that were emptying their shelves of books that were written more than 30 years before that time. So the past was out of the question. But the origins of Thomas Aquinas College, and they've been alluded to here by Tom Kaiser and Peter DeLuca, the origins are much more older than the problems of the 60s. In fact, they go back to Jerusalem and to Athens, and to an education, a vision that came out of those centers of learning, theological and philosophical. It was a vision actually that shaped Europe, that shaped the Western world, that shaped Christendom. It was a vision basically that was the heart and soul of that movement of faith-seeking understanding, fides quaerens intellectum, and that was the movement that actually brought into existence the first universities of the world, the great universities of Europe, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Salamanca, so on. It was that vision that was finally behind Thomas Aquinas College. And Ron McArthur had shared that vision from the first time he started studying philosophy. And it only grew through his life. And when he became a teacher, he championed that vision. Now, we've alluded already to how that sense of things that actually, built Christendom and built civilization was fading, was eroding through modern times, and disappearing gradually as the secular took over from the sacred more and more. So when Ron McArthur went to work as a teacher, he was already in a culture that was against everything he believed in. And this was true even as it found its way into the Catholic schools. And he had the clear vision that there was something more to Catholic education than was happening in the 20th century. And as the time went on in the 20th century, it actually got worse and worse. I met him in 1954 when he was teaching at San Francisco College for Women. That's the Madams of the Sacred Heart School. And my sister was a student of Ron McArthur's, and she wanted me to meet him, so she introduced me to him, and then we got to be friends, played a lot of tennis together, went to sporting events. Ron and Marilyn would come over to my parents' place, and we'd have these Thursday night dinners, kind of convivial affairs that a lot of people would come to. So we had plenty of opportunities then to talk and discuss things, and largely the conversations were about education. The question was, what can you do with with a poor situation, we'll call it. And I know Ron always tried to improve things, especially at Lone Mountain. He had proposals to improve and strengthen the program, to bring it back closer to its origins, closer to what was really genuine. He met a lot of resistance. He went on through his whole teaching career attempting to do this. His love of this tradition was so strong, it drove him to always want to do the right thing by it. Now, in those discussions we had way back then, it was a matter of talking about perhaps what one should do and then what one could do. And since half a loaf is better than none, you weren't going to start talking about starting your own school back in the 1950s. In fact, the 1950s was strangely, paradoxically, kind of an optimistic period. The World War II had been had a sobering effect on Americans, and in GIs in particular. Many came back and went into the religious life. In the time of Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, for example. And great books discussions were even starting. And in colleges, various classics programs came into being. At the University of Notre Dame, they brought in the general program, which was taken away from St. John's Annapolis. And then at St. Mary's College, the integrated program was also brought in from St. John's, directed by tutors from St. John's, and that actually gave Ron a lot of hope. The other programs that came about in that era turned sort of wobbly and faded and disappeared, but the integrated program had a strong impact, at least for a while. What he saw in that program was, in the Great Books program, here's a place where we're going back to the great minds and their works that actually made the West, that made our civilization. And on top of that, and maybe more significantly, St. John's had actually worked out what was the old trivium and quadrivium, the mathematical arts, I won't go through them all, and the verbal arts, logic, rhetoric, language, grammar, and so on. And they had worked them out very well, had books to help you through those, and where you needed it. But they had worked that out very well. And these were subjects that were at the core of the classical education. These were among the handmaidens to theology. These were subjects, the little rivers, as St. Thomas calls them, that one ought to travel before he enters into the great sea of wisdom. And that seemed a good thing. And in fact, here at Thomas Aquinas, we've adopted much of that. Now, through the 50s and into the 60s, it was more thinking about things and talking about them and trying to do something about them in very limited ways and not having a whole lot of success. But all the while, even though there were optimistic things going on through the 50s, the erosion that had started centuries back just continued, and things were becoming weaker and weaker. And by the end of the 60s, the whole thing erupted. There was really nothing left. And it was at that point that we began to think something has to be done. Now, we didn't know what to do, and none of us had been in the field of founding colleges, so we didn't know the first thing about it. The idea of starting your own college was almost unthinkable until, as a matter of fact, some people whose opinions we trust encouraged us to do it and said, yeah, you can do it. So that sort of led to putting together the Blue Book, the proposal for the fulfillment of Catholic liberal education, and I don't know, the chronology here isn't going to be exact, but it was in that era. And then we began to promote the college, and Dr. McArthur was, I suppose, the face of it, and he spoke eloquently to great groups of people and convinced them that this was a good thing. Now, in that sense, the idea of the college was well received, especially when they were aware that all around them in universities there was just chaos. Students were invading the college president's office, and there were riots and so on and so forth. They knew something had to be done. But as a matter of fact, most of them, though they believed in the vision that was being presented, didn't think it could happen. And think of the one case where we went to a man who had been a very successful businessman, very charitable man. He became a donor to this college, a very generous donor. But when the idea of the college was presented to him in the first place, he listened to it and then he said, well, that's a beautiful idea, it's a wonderful idea, but you can never do it. you can't bring it into existence. And so he, as he was lecturing to us why it couldn't be done, he was writing out a check for $10,000, and he pushes it across the table to Ron McArthur and says, you can't do it, but everybody deserves a chance to fail. Well, it didn't fail, and by God's good grace, it came into existence. Now, I can't help but think that it wouldn't have come into existence had we not had the leadership of Ron McArthur. His presence, his talent, his persona, his enthusiasm carried that whole movement. And then finally it happened. So I would say between God and Ron McArthur, the college is here today. Now, I understand that God is the universal and primary cause and all of these things. But in choosing Ron McArthur as his instrument, he chose very well. Now, I want to mention a couple of remarks that two men have made that is relevant to Ron and his career. The men are quite different from each other. One is a most learned man and renowned. The other man is simple and humble, and the world probably scarcely knows he exists. The first one I'm thinking of is Ralph McInerney, who was a leading philosopher in America, especially in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, certainly the leading Thomist. And he loved the college. He was on our board of governors for a while, as long as his health would allow. And he would come and visit as frequently as he could. For him, the college was an island in a sea of chaos. And he loved it, though, not because it was a refuge, but because it was a place where they were doing the right thing in the right way. So when he was our graduation speaker one year, after talking about how he assessed the college and how he felt about it and such, he went on to say that when the annals of Catholic education are drawn up, ultimately, which I suppose is at the end of time, the name McArthur will loom large in that history. Ron McArthur will have a prominent place in that story. So I mentioned the remarks of a very learned man. There was another man I wanted to mention too. You know, in Ron McArthur's large presence, which is physical and psychological both, right? You might not notice that he's a very generous person, a very kindly person. I remember, just for example, he and I were talking with a man who came to visit the first campus we were at, and the man, in the course of the conversation, looked at a fountain pen that was in Ron's pocket, and it was one of those old classic fountain pens, you know, and he looked at it and he said, "Yeah, I like that fountain pen." And Ron says, "Well, do you? Well, here, it's yours." I said, "Well, that's just like him." I think. I remember his mother once told me that when he was a little boy, he would bring the waifs and strays off the street to his home, and these were usually the kids that were rejected by their peers and didn't have friends, the uncool kids. And so Ron would make it a point to become friendly with them and then bring them home. And his mother said that went on for years. Actually, I think his friendship with me is based pretty much on the same. just another uncool person. Now, all the instances of such kindness and charity that took place in his life, only God will know about. But I do know about one that I thought I would mention to you. Ron and Marilyn had been in Quebec a number of years before I went up to study at Laval. And while they were there, they met a family, Lavoie family, I believe. And when I was leaving for Quebec, Ron said, well, you must go call on them, this Lavoie family. They're really nice people, but they have a lot of children, and they're very poor. I mean, really poor. But go see them. And so when I got to Quebec, I went to their house, called on them, and when I said, well, I've been sent by the McArthurs, the smiles came over their face, and they invited me into their humble abode, and indeed it was a humble abode. There's still a lot of children around, but they sat down and told me for a long time all of the kind things that the McArthurs had done for them while the McArthurs were in Quebec. And in particular, he said, you know, one Christmas, in their poverty, they were so poor that they couldn't afford any of the trappings of Christmas. They had no Christmas tree, no lights, no gifts for the children, nothing. All the things that marked that holy day, they couldn't afford. And Christmas Eve, there came, I gather, a knock at the door. Maybe Marilyn can straighten me out on this, but a knock on the door, and when I opened the door, who was there but Ron and Marilyn with a Christmas tree in tow, and all the decorations, and gifts for all the children, and a Christmas meal. And his face was just beaming as he was telling me this. Now, I think the McArthurs, who had just been recently married, probably were struggling so much as well for their own, to meet their own needs. But when he told me the story, he just beamed and then raised his finger to the sky and said, that man, referring to Ron, he said, when that man dies, he'll go straight to heaven. Now these two men, the learned and the simple, spoke wisely and well, I think, of the life of Ron McArthur, of a life that was that of a good man, that of a wise man, that of a holy man, and a man of extraordinary accomplishments, and of course the life of a friend, a dear friend. So now we pray that vision that Ronald McArthur had from his earliest days as a thinker, that vision that he fought for his whole life, can be fully enjoyed in its wholeness in the beatific vision. So this is eternal life, that we may know thee, the true God. God rest his soul. Thank you.